Amen. So good to be in God's house this morning. Good to have you here. Again, just good to see Jen and family back in the house of God. We've missed her, and I look forward to seeing her back up in her place here with the worship team very soon in the future. Good to have you in God's house this morning. Bless you for being here. I'm excited about what God is already doing in His house, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you the word of the Lord this morning. Let's get ready to read from the book of Joshua, and we'll read the first 8 verses from that particular chapter 4. Thanks, Nicola. And when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." And so Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you in the future when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' And tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took the 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told them, Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. We know God will bless His word. I want to share on the theme today of the journey continues. I shared a message some time ago on the journey and how God had been moving in this church and taking our people forward in this church and family and how blessed us and prospered us and was continuing to challenge us. And I have some little fresh thoughts about that particular issue and subject. Some of what you'll hear this morning you will have heard before, but it's worth repeating. And we'll continue into part 2 of the journey continues next Sunday morning as well. So if you're here this morning, you need to have some excuse to make sure you don't miss next Sunday to come and see and hear part 2 of our study. I want to talk this morning for a little time on one subject in particular concerning the journey. And the journey of ourselves as individuals, and our journey in particular as the family of God. And here's the first one. Remember where God brought you from. Remember where God brought you from. In Deuteronomy 6:12, if you go back and read that particular portion of Scripture, Moses issued a final warning to Israel just as they were about to enter the promised land. You'll know the story well. But listen to his warning. Now remember what God had done for them. God had done the miraculous. God had delivered them. God had promised them this land of plenty. And here's what their leader says to them. "Beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Wow. Everything's going fantastic. Everything's wonderful. God has blessed them. God's enabled them. God has strengthened them. God has sustained them. God has defeated their enemies. They're riding on the crest of the supernatural in the Lord and the God that they serve. And yet Moses has to remind them, don't forget your God. Don't forget where He's brought you from. You see, God realizes that we often forget what He's done for us. And in this knowledge and man's propensity to forget, it's little wonder that many times men themselves have to erect memorials to remind them what's actually happened in life. And memorials have played an important role even in biblical history and in the history of God's people. Will you remember at the foot of Mount Sinai, Moses built an altar of stones to commemorate God's covenant with Israel in Exodus 12:14. And here again on this occasion, God commands His people to erect a memorial so they don't forget what God has done for them. You know, I don't want to seem critical this morning, but I can virtually imagine that every one of us sitting in this church this morning at some point in the past, God has done something for us and we've probably already forgotten about it. And the warning comes as we continue on our journey, don't forget what God has already done. Remember where God has brought us from. Listen to this. When all the people had completely crossed over the Jordan, then the Lord gave more specific instructions in verses 2 to 5. Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, one from every tribe, and take those stones out of the midst of the Jordan and place them where the priest's feet stood. You can carry them over with you and leave them in the lodging place where you lodge tonight. And then Joshua called 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, one from each tribe, and said, cross over the Jordan before the ark of the Lord into the middle of the Jordan, and each one take up a stone on his shoulder. Now these must have been pretty large stones to have to be carried on their shoulders. And according to these further verses, the 12 men who were chosen were to go back to where the priests were standing in the middle of the water holding the ark. Each man was to pick up a large stone and carry it to the side of the river where they would camp that night and build a memorial. I want to leave with you 3 reasons that it's right to do this, to build these memorials. It's right to take these actions and remember where God has brought us from and what God has done for us. Here's the first one. And these stones, it says, shall be a memorial to the children of Israel forever. They're a memorial to remind us again that God has already blessed us to where he's brought us now. Look, these memorial stones are a reminder of their own personal experience, first of all, for what God had done to them individually, but also a reminder of what God had done to them collectively as a nation and as the family of God. And in verse 6, this little reminder is put right in there, and this is so important. Now, come on, parents especially, I want you to listen up. It says, verse 6, that these memorials will cause the children to ask, what do these stones mean to you? You see, these stones were to be a reminder for everyone who was present, and especially to the young, the children of the flock and of the nation and of their families, of what God had already done. In other words, these memorials were saying, we've got a story to tell, and here's a reminder of that story. They're there to keep a clear memory of what God has already done for us. And these stones would remind them to keep on telling the stories to each and every generation so that God's people would never lose the wonder and the awe of the God they loved, the God they served, and what God had already done for them. Can I ask you a question this morning? To all of us, but to those of us who have families in particular. Do we keep reminding our families of the wonders that God has done for us? Do we remind our homes, our families, our children, our relatives of who we are in God and what God has done? Or is it something we as believers neglect? You know, the world's always keen to boast about its heroes, isn't it? Great war heroes like Winston Churchill. Great football players who I haven't a clue who any of the great football players are. Not a notion. But the world boasts about them and pays them millions upon millions of pounds to get out and blow a ball up and down a field that I don't even know what's inside the ball. Hot air for all I know. But the world boasts on them. Great historical figures and famous victories and battles that have been won. And yet we as Christians are often so reticent to boast about what Jesus has done for us. For our well-being, for our health, for our strength, for the blessings that he gives us. And the next generation in particular, we are told, is not to forget what God has done for us. Can I ask us all this morning, what kind of memorials are we building in the journey? You know, whether we realize it or not, we all have those memorials in our lives. Maybe not a monument of stones, but other memories, other stories, other things that we can witness for as memorials to what God has already done when he's brought us this far. There are memories of times, memories of places that trigger memories just as those stones in Gilgal did. There are significant moments in our life and in yours and in mine that elicit we store those memories and that we occasionally bring them out and boast about them for what God has done. I personally can boast about the night I was saved as a teenager at 17 years of age. Then I can boast also and build a memorial to the fact that a few years later I was called to preach the gospel and ordained into the ministry and have the call of God in my life. I remember so well the first date with Susie. And a bit of a disaster it was too. Remember it, Susie? There was me, all puffed up, you know, well dressed. Everything wonderful, ready to take Susie on her first date. I'd booked one of the poshest restaurants in Northern Ireland to take her down, overlooking the sea on the balcony, ready for this beautiful meal so that she'd be impressed. Called for her, picked her up, drove down to the restaurant, which had booked like 3 weeks in advance, and the daft place had closed its doors and shut down. Quite a memorial, eh? But I remember my first date with Susie. I remember so well the birth of my kids, and then, of course, the wonderful gift of grandkids. Special things, special times, special places that I have built as memorials to the goodness of God. What have you built as a memorial to Him? What can you boast about in God? All of us have something today we can boast about and where God has brought us to right now. Let's remember what God has done on the journey we've already taken. Memories of people who have blessed us. Memories of loved ones and family, some who may not be here anymore, but things that they've placed into our lives while they were here with us. For me, many of those people who encouraged me to pursue the ministry and helped me grow in God. How often do we sit down and not just think about those things, but thank God for those people and the things He's given us and the blessings in our lives and use them to build an altar for God and encouraging others to go forward on the journey? You have, I'm sure, and I have many memories of experiences of God answering prayers, of God dealing with situations that seemed impossible, seeing God's marvelous hand of provision. I remember how God always provided for our needs as a couple and as a family when we started to have our kids. And we learned so many invaluable lessons on faith and depending on God. I know you have too. And these lessons in faith are not something you can be taught. It's something you have to experience by allowing God to do things in your life. Memories of the past, those sentimental things that trigger in our hearts. The things that God did that we've experienced that only God could have done. Come on, do we remember them? Do we give thanks for them? Do they encourage us to keep going on the journey? Here's the point. God knows how we think, and that's the reason He instructed His people here to build memorials so they wouldn't forget Him. And yet so often we grumble, we moan, we complain, we gripe. We're not happy with this, we're not happy with that. The preacher isn't preaching the right stuff. The worship team isn't singing the right songs. Somebody in church gets on our nerves. Those people are bugging us. And all the time God's saying, remember what I've done for you. Remember where I've brought you from and where I've brought you to. Every time the Israelites saw this memorial, they'd be reminded they had not crossed the Jordan on their own ability. They'd got there only because of the strength and the power of their God. I challenge all of us this morning, even when you go home this week, to spend time thinking through your memorial stones and let them draw you closer to God and strengthen you for the rest of the journey that lies ahead. I want you to note something else also. These memorial stones were to serve as the basis of sharing their faith, yes, with their children, and their generation after them in particular. And in 2 places in this chapter, parents in particular are reminded of their responsibility of communicating God's word and calling on their children from generation to generation. Listen to verses 6 and 7. We mentioned it already. What do these stones mean to you? The children will ask. Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And when it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones shall be a memorial to your children forever. You see, as with many other memorials that were laid, especially in the Old Testament, the intention of these memorials was to provoke questions from future generations in particular. Can I issue a little warning this morning? And you know I'm right when I say this. Just look out there at that crazy, mixed up world that we live in. Our faith is never more than one generation away from extinction. I'll say that again. This faith that we love and serve in, this Christianity that has blessed us so much, is never more than one generation from extinction. And if we're not careful, this nation of ours could well be Exhibit A for this truth of extinction of Christianity and our faith. Just think for one moment how far our country has drifted away from its biblical foundations in just one single generation. Prayer in most of our schools is declared illegal. Our children, most of them leave school today unless something really amazing has happened and they couldn't even quote you the Lord's Prayer. Bible reading in schools is either outlawed or discouraged. In many places, the Ten Commandments is not allowed to be taught. And God's warning to his people then is the same warning that he issues to us today. Remember where God has brought you from and the blessings that you have right to this moment. And don't forget to keep on declaring the good things, the truths, the principles, and living them out in our generation. Otherwise, we're liable to be extinct. God's warning to them was not to let the environment of their pagan society dictate their values and how they lived. And isn't exactly that what the world is trying to do to us? It's telling us as Christians how they want us to live. They don't mind us having church. They don't mind us opening our church doors every Sunday and worshiping together, as long as we do it the way they want us to do it and we don't have an influence on the world around us. These memorial stones were to be a signpost to a lost world and society. Listen to what verse 24 says, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Here's the bottom line, folks. It's been God's plan all along that the whole world should know that he is the only living God. And here in this portion we've read, not only was the crossing of the Jordan a stirring event for Israel, it was to be an event for all people living in the land of Canaan as a witness that God is still all-powerful. He is the one and only true and living God. We better not forget the awesome power and nature of the God we serve, and we should be demonstrating it to the world around us and showing and witnessing to the greatness of our God. Come on, folks, let's make sure we teach it to our children. For those of us who are parents and grandparents, let's make sure they're often in God's house. Let's influence our homes and our families by telling them about the memorials in our lives and making sure that we are a witness for God in this generation. I don't know how long God will tarry, but I want little Eli here to grow up in an environment where he knows about the things of God. And when I'm dead and gone, he can stand, even maybe in this church, and witness to the fact that he knew that his grandfather and his granny and his parents and everybody else who he comes in contact with, he's able to say, yes, I know about God. I know about God. I know about the faith of my forefathers. Secondly, let me move on quickly. Not only was it a time for remembering about what God had already done and where God had brought them to, it was also about renewing their personal commitment to the journey. Listen to verse 8. And the children of Israel did so just as Joshua commanded, took up the stones from the Jordan, and as the Lord had spoken to Joshua, to the number of tribes of the children of Israel, and they carried them over with them to the place they lodged, and they laid them down there. Now here's the interesting thing. Joshua not only issued the order for the men to go back, but he personally joined them as they made their journey back to the center of the riverbed and gathered up those stones. Listen, it says, then Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant stood, and they are there to this day. Joshua got personally involved and made a personal commitment in this very private act to go and continue on his journey and his walk with God. Once the 12 men had carried the stones to the shore of Canaan, and after Joshua had built his altar in the middle of the river, he commanded the priests to finish crossing the river with the Ark of the Covenant. It says this in verse 15. Then the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, command the priests who bear the Ark of the Testimony to come up from the Jordan. Joshua therefore commanded the priests, saying, come up from the river. It came to pass when the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord had come from the Jordan, and the soles of the priests touched the dry land, that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all of its banks as before. God honored their commitment and obedience to the rest of the journey. The fact that they walked through that riverbed and crossed to the other side and stood on the shores of the other side of the river was a sign and a monument to the fact that they were saying, we're going on with God. But that's the question for us today, personally and collectively as the family of God. Are we ready for the journey that still continues? Are we ready to commit to what God has for us? Oh, we rejoice and we remember what God has done for us. Well, it's great today as we sit in the house of God and look all around us and see the blessing of God. But the next question comes, are we content just to sit as we are? Or are we ready to commit for what comes next? And we'll talk more about that next week. But I want you to think about that and ponder about that. What is God asking of me, of you today in that personal commitment that's required for the rest of the journey? What step of faith, what change of direction, what sacrifice? Is it in committing to your finances and putting them in the hands of God? Is it committing to more personal devotion? Is it giving more of your time to God? Is it giving of your talents to God? Is it leaving your family and committing them to the care and keeping of God? Look at what God has done for us right up to this moment. But understand, God is the God of more, and He wants to do more, but He needs us to commit to it. To commit to it. To use an Ulster expression, to stop faffing around and stop just playing at church, but get serious and say, God, whatever comes next, I'm glad you've brought me to this point, but I'm committing to what lies ahead. What is it God's asking you personally to do today? What is He asking of you personally to commit to Him that you haven't fully committed before? And what about us as a church? What's God going to bring for us tomorrow, next week, next month, next year? You know what? I don't know. I honestly say I don't know. But I know God has something for us. But are we ready to commit to it? Because the next and third point in this little study this morning is this. You see, walking across that river, coming out on the other side and building those monuments was not just about remembering their past, about making that personal commitment. It was about also moving then into the future that God had for them. Listen to verses 19-20. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. Verse 20 tells us. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. It's significant that this event that we read this morning happened on the 10th day of the first month. That is, it happened exactly 40 years to the day since Israel marched out of Egypt. I love God's timing. It's brilliant. Leaving the edge of that river, the Israelites went to the place called Gilgal and made their camp, which is on the eastern border of Jericho. Gilgal, this word literally means this. This is fantastic. This is how God does stuff. The reproach has been taken away. God was saying, I've set you up for your future. And look, we know it now. They didn't know it then, but just literally after God had said, you're in Gilgal because your reproach has been rolled away, I've already got Jericho ready to collapse for you and take you into the promised land. 40 years of spiritual defeat and failure rolled away, the dawn of a new beginning. The days of sullen refusal to respond to God under Moses were gone. Complaining was ended. Hopelessness, wandering in the wilderness was behind him. They were now, as they touched the banks of the other side of that river, a new people, a powerful people with a new purpose in God and a huge promised land to take for the glory of God and for the blessing of their nation. And as we look to the journey that still lies ahead of us, we can look back and see those monumental occasions which God has done powerful things, and He's going to do them again. We can look back and see how God has changed direction, and He may want to do that again with us. We know God brought us to this place miraculously, and we know God can do miraculous things for us in the future. And if we're ready to commit to it, then God has already a future established for us if we're ready to walk into it. The monument that was built with those 12 stones was to serve as a visible reminder to the faithfulness of God to His people. And we have those visible reminders of God's goodness today to remind us, yes, there's more. There's more. There's more. Let us today not forget where God has brought us from. You know, just over 12 years ago, Susan, myself, Marty and Lois responded to the call of God and set out on a journey with nothing but faith and hope and trust in God. For all of us, it meant traveling basically halfway around the world to get back to Belfast. I mean, it's brilliant how God does stuff. He takes you halfway around the world and then brings you back to where you started again. I love it. It meant traveling halfway around the world. It meant a change of our own plans and ambitions. There was Marty and Lois hoping to set up a new life in the beautiful Gold Coast of Australia. Marty working in Christian radio, fulfilling one of his dreams and ambitions. Lois doing well in the job that she had there. New family being born and birthed, ready to live that wonderful sunshine life on the Gold Coast. And what does God say? Get back to dull, dreary Belfast. But that's what God does. Mightn't have been the journey they wanted at that moment, but that's the journey God had for them. And there's me weeping and crying because I had to leave my had to leave my 35th anniversary Mustang with its huge V8 and 240 brake horsepower. Had to leave it and contract and by the fate. What's the Lord trying to do? A journey. We didn't know it was going to happen. But you know what? Literally within a few weeks of our step of faith, God found us a cinema to worship in. Anybody remember it? Anybody still? Cinema we worshipped in? And then 3 months into the next new year, God miraculously gave us this building that we stand in today. The journey. The journey. We didn't know what was ahead of us. And we don't know from tomorrow even what's ahead of us. But God has a future for us. And the monuments that we've already built in our personal lives and as a family of God, God has a future for us. And to this very Sunday, in this building that we share this morning, God has proved himself worthy, God has fulfilled his promises, and God has been faithful in meeting our needs. I'm going to ask the worship team girls to come out if somebody would give them a wee bit of notice. But God gave us this place miraculously because a few people were willing to step out and take the journey. Look at the increase. Look at the increase. Just look around you this morning. A place that we call home. A great church family. What a great bunch of folks we are. All our financial needs as a family of God have been met and surpassed. We've seen salvation in this house. We've seen the miraculous healing of people's lives in this house. We've seen broken lives restored. We've seen the lonely given love and hope. All for the glory of God. Look where God has brought us right to this point. But God has a future for us. You all know the story. I'm sure you do anyway. Why I light this little box up. I'm walking away from the camera here, but I'm sure it'll find me again. If you don't know the story, I'll tell it to you sometime again. I don't have time this morning. But when Susan and I and Marty and Lois answered the call and stepped out into Belfast and said, we're going to start a work. Here's what we had. That, which basically is like from the late 1970s. We had that. I had a guitar and Marty had a drum kit, which is still in existence somewhere, Marty, isn't it? That was it. But look where God has brought us to. Come on, church. Look where God has brought us to. But there's more. House of Worship stands as a memorial to the goodness of God. I want you to come back next week for part 2 of The Journey Continues. And the theme for next week is, don't forget where you're going. Remember where we've come from. But let's also not forget where we're going, because God has a plan. Here's the question today. for all of us today, some others maybe more than others in particular, today God's call for us to build our personal monuments to the grace and the love of God that witnesses to what God has done for each of us. You see, the monument they built was a silent reminder to the special day on which God boldly placed their feet in the surging, rushing currents of the Jordan, but confident that God would see them safely to the other side. And as individuals and as this church at House of Worship, God has a future for us, but it might mean God asking us to cross our Jordans and step out into the rushing waters of the next part of his plan. And why do we need those memorials built? So that when the difficulties come as we step out in faith, so that when the problems arise, and they will as we step out in faith, as the obstacles come and the roadblocks come and stand in our way, we can look back and say, look what God has already done. Look where he's brought us to this very day, and have the hope and the confidence to go forward in the future that God has for us as his people, and press on in trust and in faith. We're still on a journey. More about that next week. Are you ready? Will you remember the goodness of God? And will you commit again afresh and anew to take that next step of faith, whatever it might be? I don't know what it is. You know, when we opened this building some almost 13 years ago, this November I think it will be, God gave me a 5-year plan. I knew specifically where we were going. Then God gave me a 3-year plan. And I knew specifically where we were going. And then, you know what? I drew a blank. I have to be honest. I drew a blank. I suddenly found myself in a situation. God, where do we go next? It's been so clear up to now. Where do we go next? And I want you to think back, those of you who have good memories. When that happened, I was preaching a message. Literally. I guess I said in the course of that message, I was preaching on Nehemiah and about what God had commanded him to do. And one of the points I made was God said that here's when I'm giving you the plan. And then God said, but it's not going to happen for another 3 months. And I thought, why has God asked me to mention that? Why did God ask me to say that? Because I haven't a clue what God wants me to do or where he wants me to take this church next. But I felt it in my spirit. I felt it in my gut, if you want to say that something significant was going to happen. Something that was going to define our church for the days that lay ahead. And I should think back and remember, and all of a sudden it came to the realization, literally within 3 months of me issuing that warrant from God, COVID-19 struck and decimated our nation and caused chaos in the church of Jesus Christ. Now, why am I sharing with you that this morning? I honestly have to be, as your pastor this morning, truthful with you and say, I wish God had given me another plan for the next year, or the next 3 years, or the next 5 years. But I don't. But you see that feeling I had back then just before COVID hit? It's as strong in my gut this morning as I've ever felt it. I feel the stirrings of God. I feel the pressure. Am I confused a little by it? Yes. But I'm so confident. I'm so confident that God's put something in my spirit that we need to be ready for what God wants to do next. It could be magnificent. We could be hanging from those rafters. Or it might be one of the hardest experiences we've ever had to face. I don't know. But God's asking today for us to remember where he's brought us from and where he's brought us to, and he's asking us to commit today to whatever is on tomorrow's headlines, whatever it is that comes our way as individually or as the church. God says, I want you to recommit to the future that I have ready for you. And it is ready. Are we ready to run into it? God bless you.